The first epistle of Paul to the Thessalonians, chapter 5, verse 11. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. The first of the somatosensory pathways we're going to take a look at is the primary pain pathway. Abbreviations in this part of our lecture include STT, spinothalamic tract, AL, anterolateral, CNS, central nervous system, VPL, ventral posterolateral, and DRG, dorsal root ganglion. A Greek letter you will see in today's lecture is delta. There are several different types of nociceptive stimuli. These include mechanical, extremes of temperature, and chemical. Mechanical would be anything that would deform the skin with the potential to cause disruption of the cell membrane. Temperature could be either extreme cold or extreme hot, anything that has that potential to actually damage the tissue. And chemical would be things that are released during inflammatory processes, such as prostaglandins and histamines. The receptor for nociception is a nociceptor. The afferent axon carrying nociception from the receptor to the central nervous system is an A delta or C pseudounipolar neuron. Pain is more than just a sensation. Pain is actually a very complex phenomenon. As a result, there are actually several pain pathways within the nervous system. We have several different structures and tracts and pathways within the spinal cord, brainstem, and cerebrum that all contribute and integrate their information together to provide the individual with their experience of pain. There is one pathway that I'm going to ask you to know for this class, and this is the primary pain pathway. We'll learn one for the body, and in the next unit we'll learn one for the face. These pathways are not called primary because they're the most important, nor because they carry the most information. They're called primary because these are the pathways that provide us with a conscious awareness of pain and allow us to be able to localize or to determine the location of that painful stimulus. The primary pain pathway for the body is known as the spinothalamic pathway. As I mentioned, there are several different pain pathways. And when looking at the information from the body, these pathways travel together in adjacent tracts within the anterolateral system of the spinal cord and the spinal lemniscus of the brainstem. But they terminate in different regions of the central nervous system in order to provide us with different aspects of the pain experience. The additional pain pathways provide many of the nuances of pain, such as what the pain means to the individual and the saliency or importance of the stimulus to that person. They go to areas involved with the autonomic nervous system and with our responses to threats, providing us with autonomic and behavioral responses to the painful stimulus. They help to create memories by going to memory areas of the brain so that we recall the stimulus and the context in which it occurred in. This way we might avoid similar incidents in the future, or it may alter our behaviors in some way. The alternate pathways also create attention to the pain. They help us to pay attention to it so we don't further hurt ourselves. and they create arousal. You might notice your heart rate or your blood pressure going up, or you're sweating when you're having pain. And finally, these additional pain pathways help to activate endogenous or built-in pathways back down to the spinal cord that can either amplify the pain or inhibit the pain. So now let's talk about the primary pain pathway, the spinothalamic pathway, that is carrying pain information from the body to the conscious perception of pain in the brain. The primary pain pathway utilizes the spinothalamic tract in the spinal cord and brainstem. This tract begins in the spinal cord, runs through the brainstem, and terminates in the thalamus. It terminates in a nucleus of the thalamus called the ventral posterolateral nucleus, abbreviated VPL. As we saw in the image of a typical spinal cord segment, the spinothalamic tract is located anterolaterally in the spinal cord, wrapping itself around the ventral horn. Previously, we used to believe that only the lateral spinothalamic tract carried neurons in the primary pain pathway. And although nociception in the primary pain pathway is transmitted more so in the lateral spinothalamic tract than in the anterior spinothalamic tract, we now know there is so much overlap between these two tracts that we are not going to separate the two. So as I mentioned earlier, please just know spinothalamic tract. As the spinothalamic tract ascends from the spinal cord into the brainstem, it remains lateral within the brainstem. It moves progressively more and more posterior, however, as it ascends in the brainstem. So by the time it reaches the midbrain, it is in a more posterior position than what it is in the spinal cord and the more caudal aspect of the brainstem. Once the spinothalamic tract terminates on neurons in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, the next neuron continue from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. These neurons leave the thalamus and take the posterior limb of the internal capsule to the corona radiata to the cortex. You'll recall that a capsule is an area where there are going to be multiple tracts running through it. And the corona radiata is really an area within the cerebrum that is composed of neuron axons that are either heading towards the cortex or descending down from the cortex. So we have neurons that are in the spinal cord that are taking the spinothalamic tract up through the spinal cord and through the brainstem to the thalamus, where they synapse on other neurons, which then leave the thalamus, take the posterior limb of the internal capsule to the corona radiata in order to get to their destination of the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex is located on two gyri that are continuous with each other. In essence, we have a gyrus that simply changes name once it reaches the top of the cerebrum just outside of the longitudinal fissure, so that the part that is within the longitudinal fissure on the medial side of the hemisphere has one name, and the part that is more on the superior and lateral aspect of the hemisphere has another. The gyrus that is located on the more medial aspect of the hemisphere within that longitudinal fissure is known as the posterior paracentral gyrus. The part that is located more on the outside, the lateral aspect of the brain and much of that superior aspect of the cerebrum is known as the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is going to sit immediately posterior to the central sulcus. The posterior paracentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus are located in the parietal lobe. The primary somatosensory cortex is highly organized. Within the cortex, we have a representation of the human body. This representation of the human body is known as the sensory homunculus. A homunculus means little man. And again, it's like having a little man represented on your brain. Somatotopic organization means that information from one area of the body is going to always go to one particular area, and so that the whole organization, if you will, of the cortex here is based upon this body representation. So we have a specific relation between body regions and corresponding areas of the brain. You'll recall that when you process information a lot, that particular information will end up getting a larger amount of representation or more neurons utilized to process that information than information that has little processing needs and requirements. And this is going to be true for the primary somatosensory cortex. Some areas of our body are more sensitive than others. They have more sensory receptors per unit area, and they are just more sensitive in general, like the pads of your fingers or the cornea of your eye. They are more sensitive than, for instance, the skin on your back. So our homunculus does not look like a real person because the proportions are off. With the sensory homunculus, the more sensitive areas of the body receive larger areas of cortical representation than areas that are less sensitive. So when you look at a picture of the homunculus, you will note that there are large areas of representation on the primary somatosensory cortex for processing sensory information from the hand and face. The lips are gigantic, and the foot is also very large. But relatively, when you look at the lower extremity, it's quite small compared to the amount of cortex devoted to these other regions. So the areas for the proximal part of the upper extremity, the lower extremity, and the trunk are relatively small on the cortex, while the hand, face, foot, and the lips are very large. The trunk, upper extremity, hand, and face are represented on the postcentral gyrus located superiorly and laterally on the brain. The trunk is located closest to the longitudinal fissure, most superiorly. And then moving laterally, we go in the order of the upper extremity, the hand, and the face. The lower extremity is represented more medially on the posterior paracentral gyrus. It starts kind of at the top of the longitudinal fissure and then goes down into the longitudinal fissure and has the hip at the top, and as we go into the fissure, we go down into the thigh, the leg, and then the foot. As I mentioned, the hand, face, and the foot have very large areas of representation on the cortex. So now we're going to go through the primary pain pathway step by step. I'm going to take this one a little bit slower since it's our first pathway, but many of the things that we talk about with this pathway will carry over into some of the other pathways we're going to be discussing. The receptor for pain is a nociceptor. So the first thing that happens is we stimulate the nociceptor. Stimulation of the nociceptor results in the opening of modality-gated ion channels. If we get sufficient summation of the receptor potentials that are generated, an action potential will then be generated at the trigger zone and will propagate along either an A delta or a C afferent if we are in the skin, or a type 3 or type 4 afferent if we are in the muscles or joints or tendons. The cell body of the pseudounipolar neuron that is propagating the action potential is in a dorsal root ganglion. The central axon of the pseudounipolar neuron is going to travel in the dorsal root to the dorsal horn of the entering spinal cord segment. And now I'd like to make a bit of a side note from the primary pain pathway. This side note is not specific to the primary pain pathway, but it is going to be something that we're going to want to recall in a couple of weeks when we start talking about spinal cord injury. For now, you're going to tuck it off to the side of your brain. But when we get to the spinal cord injury, we're going to pull it back out because it's going to help to explain some of the signs and symptoms you see with one particular type of spinal cord injury. So as our central axon of our afferent neuron is entering the spinal cord and going to the dorsal horn, it's going to give off branches called collaterals. These collaterals are going to go up and down the spinal cord for a few segments, usually 2 or 3 segments, in a tract known as Lissauer's tract. Lissauer's tract is located in the region where sensory neurons enter the spinal cord. If you go back to the image where we had the typical spinal cord segment and the tracts were shown, I did label Lissauer's tract on that image to give you a sense of where it's located. So our pseudounipolar neuron, central axon, enters the spinal cord and goes to the dorsal horn, but also sends these collaterals up and down the spinal cord in Lissauer's tract for 2 to 3 spinal cord segments. Those collaterals then enter the dorsal horn at those levels. The purpose of these collaterals appear to be the modulation of excitability within the spinal cord in the area, particularly in the presence of an injury. They also are involved with spinal cord reflexes, and we'll talk about those next week when we get into the motor system. But if you think about it, like if you touch a hot stove, you jerk away right away. You pull away. And that requires several different muscles to do that. So you need to activate several parts of the spinal cord. And these collaterals help that to happen. They also appear to give us an alternate route when there is injury to the spinal cord. So let's draw this out. So we have a spinal cord segment here. Here's what it looks like with our first order afferent drawn in. And the end of the peripheral axon, we have a nociceptor or type 4 receptor. The name is dependent upon if we're in the skin or if we are in muscle, tendon, or joint. That peripheral process is an A delta or C if we're in skin, a type 3 or 4 if we're in the deeper tissues. It's a pseudounipolar neuron, so we can see that the cell body is elevated off of the central and peripheral processes. And that soma is located in the dorsal root ganglion. The central process then enters the spinal cord and goes to the dorsal horn. Once the first order afferent reaches the dorsal horn, it is going to synapse on a second order neuron whose soma and dendrites are located within the dorsal horn. The axon of the second order neuron is going to cross the spinal cord in the anterior white commissure and enter the contralateral spinal thalamic tract. It is going to ascend in the spinal thalamic tract up through the spinal cord and the brainstem and go to the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, where it will synapse on a third order neuron. Here we have another side note, this time related to the second order neuron. Evidence suggests that the second order neuron ascends rostrally 1 to 2 segments as it is crossing the spinal cord, that it doesn't go straight across, but it ascends slightly as it crosses. Again, This is a side note, so please just tuck it off to the side of your brain. But we'll come back to this when we are talking about a particular spinal cord injury. When the second order neuron reaches the ventroposterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, it synapses on a third order neuron, whose axon is going to leave the thalamus and go up to the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe, taking the posterior limb of the internal capsule and the corona radiata to get there. Once the third order neuron reaches the primary somatosensory cortex and synapses on neurons there, conscious pain perception and localization of the noxious stimulus occurs. Here are a couple of links that'll just show you different images of the entire primary pain pathway. Your textbook also has images of the pathways, and your textbook shows them both drawn with neurons, but also drawn in a more schematic fashion. Let's draw our own primary pain pathway. So here we have our representation of the central nervous system. We have our spinal cord segment at the bottom that's been kind of flipped up so we can see it. And then we have the very top of the spinal cord, our brainstem, and our cerebrum up above. Now here is our primary pain pathway. I'm going to get a pointer here. So just a second. There we go. So you can see over here we have our nociceptor. That's receiving the information that something is causing tissue damage or potentially causing tissue damage. It's going to open up modality-gated channels, which is going to cause action potentials to be generated if there's sufficient summation in my A delta or C first order afferent. Now I've selected to have my pain stimulus occur on the dorsal aspect of the proximal thumb. So I know from anatomy and recalling my cutaneous innervation that that area of the skin is innervated by the radial nerve. So my A delta or C first order afferent is going to be traveling in the radial nerve. The cell body will be located in the dorsal root ganglion, and its central axon is going to enter the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. In this case, I know from my dermatomes that the thumb is innervated by the C6 spinal cord segment, so I know that this is C6, so I have that labeled right here. My second order neuron is going to go from the dorsal horn, where the cell body is located, cross the spinal cord in the anterior white commissure, that's this little area of white matter right there, and it's going to enter the spinal thalamic tract, where it's going to ascend in the spinal cord, continue up through the brainstem, and please note how lateral the spinal thalamic tract is, both in the spinal cord and also all the way up through the brainstem. It's going to go through the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain, and it's going to synapse on the third order neuron in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. The third order neuron is going to go over to the lateral aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. So note my nociceptor was over on the right thumb, but my termination of the pathway is in the left primary somatosensory cortex because the information crossed over down here in the spinal cord. So the left side of my brain is receiving pain information from the right side of my body, and the right side of my brain would receive pain information from the left side of my body. Visceral pain is pretty unique in that recent evidence is indicating it may not travel primarily in the spinal thalamic tract like other types of pain, but instead may travel in the dorsal column. This is still unclear, and I'm not going to ask you about this on an exam. And it may not be consistent from one organ to another. So for our purposes, we're going to disregard visceral pain at this time. But I do want you to understand that visceral sensation does ascend bilaterally, and it's processed in different areas of the brain than cutaneous sensation. That bilateral ascension of sensation becomes important when we start talking about spinal cord injury and the impact of spinal cord injury on visceral functioning. And then finally, I want to just mention the itch pathway. This is closely associated to pain, but it is actually distinct from pain. You have free nerve endings that are different from the nociceptors that give us the perception of itch. Itch pretty much travels only on C fibers. The pathway for itch at this time is uncertain.